Hello, good evening, and welcome to your go-to platform for everything politics, policy, and governance. My name is Abdullahi Ahmed. Welcome to Daily Politics on Trust TV. Tonight on the program, President Ahmed Tinubu has called for urgent debt relief for Nigeria and other developing nations on the African continent. Speaking at the 79th UN General Assembly, the President, represented by Vice President Kashim Shettima, urged global leaders to prioritize debt forgiveness and commit multilateral cooperation, warning that without special concessions, the global south cannot make meaningful progress. With Nigeria's debt soaring to over 121 trillion naira, can the international community afford to ignore this plea? Join us to unpack and dimension the takeaways from Nigeria's national statement at the United Nations General Assembly is veteran diplomat Haruna Warkani. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, viewers.
All right, let's set the motion for the conversation with, of course, the Vice President's speech reflecting on developments on the African continent, especially with regards to economic prosperity.
The question of governance is at the heart of our problems and also the solution to them. We recognize this in Nigeria when on 12th June this year, we celebrated a quarter of a century of unbroken democratic rule. We are no less proud of this achievement than the fact that during the last 2 decades, a sustained process of democratization has swept over Africa. However, the return of unconstitutional changes of government and forceful military takeovers in some countries of the Sahel underscore the fragility of democracy when it is not backed by economic development and sustained peace and security. It is this fragility, rather than the milestone that democratic governance has achieved in Africa, that should matter most in our deliberations at this and other high-level segments of the 79th session of the General Assembly. While we are for all possible changes of government, we can also recognize the impatience in cities and villages as the sometimes slow and grinding turn of the wheel of democracy. Our people need employment. They need decent livelihoods. They desire good and affordable education and health care for their children and families. They need to live in healthy, safe, and secure environments. They need hope and they need opportunity. They desire to live in peace and tranquility, to pursue whatever gives them happiness and contentment. When governments fail to deliver, the people are bound to question the utility of democracy and other ideals like rule of law. The global debt burden undermines the capacity of countries and governments to meet the needs of their citizens. Creeping trade barriers and protectionist policies are destroying the hopes for prosperity of peoples and nations. Unbridled competition, rather than cooperation, is discouraging incentives driving our investments. Above all, insecurity is driving people into unprecedented hardship and misery that in turn affect the people's confidence in democracy. It is the duty of the international community to bring back confidence in democratic rule and constitutional order.
Right, part of the speech there, the national statement by the Vice President Kashim Shettima, who represented President Ahmed Tinubu at the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly, speaking about democracy, threat to democracy on the continent, good governance, and all of the gaps that exist within the African continent. Of course, we'll be breaking down the speech part by part, but let's start on that particular note with our guest, veteran diplomat Haruna Warkani, who is here with us in the studio. Your 2 cents on our national statement, especially this particular part, because at the onset of the Tinubu administration, ECOWAS was rocked significantly with the series of coups that happened. The first one, of course, that the Tinubu administration has had to deal with, especially because of his role as leader of ECOWAS, ceremonious leader of the ECOWAS community, was to deal with the Niger fallout. What do you make of how the statement encapsulates the threat to democracy or the survival of democracy on the continent, and also talking about good governance and how there are so many gaps that has compounded the economic situation of millions of Africans?
Well, thank you, viewers, and pleasure to be here once again. Now, on the outset, we can see that here is a speech that I can say good delivery, content-wise, a little below expectation, let me say. It could have been better, one way or the other. Now, on the issues raised, democracy, you can see in between the lines when you read this speech or listen very carefully, you will find where there seems to be now an acceptance that democracy might not necessarily be the only pathway to development. And the experiences or recent experiences of ECOWAS in this regard clearly shows that I think Mr. President is thinking and perhaps trying as best to assuage the feelings that had erupted, creating problem for ECOWAS in the first place. Now, sincerely, you can see here the so-called or common euphemism of dividends of democracy seems not to be delivered, and that leaves citizens within Africa generally a little, maybe less satisfied to this system of government than otherwise. And I think it's good that there is like an acceptance of these failings and also requirements that yes, we can sustain democracy, but perhaps done better in the context of rule of law, etc. But the underlying factor would be there must be good governance to deliver livelihoods for the citizens, because what is the essence of democracy if at the end of the day people are not happy? I think that's the import of the message. Now, beyond that, we in Africa generally have seen how our democratic institutions have been abused, and in the process, the wrong persons have found themselves in positions of power. And with that, we lack what should ordinarily come for democracy: good governance, livelihoods, improved healthcare, education, infrastructure, etc., etc. And therefore, the speech might have touched on some of these things, but going deeper, I think, is what is now missing.
Yeah. And in the grand scheme of things, this is the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly since its establishment. How important is it in moving the needle?
Well, 79 years as a series, it has become a national annual ritual for heads of state to come and express their sentiments and their overview of what has happened before the last one, and then their perspective as to what they expect of the international community. This 79th UNGA, well, more or less is the same like the previous one, and the agenda setting is a common practice. Every nation, territory, or jurisdiction comes around to say, we expect the international community to do A, B, C, D. These are our expectations and the rest of them. Now, for instance, the question of insecurity that has become pervasive all over particularly Africa, but not restricted to Africa, because insecurity has become global concern. The United Nations has surely fallen behind in the expectations of global citizens as to what should have been done or achieved. If up to this moment, 79 years after, we are yet to achieve global peace, that is a kind of misnomer, because what has mankind been doing in the past years that up to today, we are not just dealing with old crises, new ones are breaking almost every day. That is the challenge for the United Nations. And you could see leader after leader, the whole thing remains almost the same.
Yeah. And has it become a talk shop a symbolic traditional gesture where everybody does virtue signals about what the problems are and the best way forward, but immediately after this, business as usual?
Well, I think you have summarized it excellently. It's a talk shop. We can't run away from that fact. And accepting some few instances in the past where some leaders have come and challenged the international community in a way that you couldn't help it but to look for solutions frontally, it has remained a talk shop. The United Nations as an institution is somehow incapable of actually resolving some of the global conflicts and challenges of hunger, pandemic, injustices, etc., etc. So you begin to see that every year people will come. The agenda is never ending, but the issues remain contentious.
Yeah. Okay, so let's listen in to some of what the Vice President, who, by the way, I think has set a record as the first Vice President to officially represent Nigeria in that particular setting. Of course, it's something, a bit of a trivial point to make, but let's listen into what Vice President Kashim Shettima had to say in that national message.
Addressing the root causes of conflict is often the first step towards providing long-term solutions. Clearly, some of the root causes of conflicts are social in nature, including poverty, hunger, ignorance, inequality, and exclusion, as well as other forms of injustice. In the Sudan, other parts of our continent are further afield. Foreign actors are exacerbating these tensions to prolong conflict and deepen the suffering of innocent people. Today, we are all witnesses to the heart-wrenching situation in Gaza and other Palestinian territories. We cannot discuss war and peace, conflicts and resolution, or humanitarian imperatives today without reflecting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been raging since 7th August last year. Of course, the conflict predates this period and has been simmering for a better part of half a century. What it tells us is that the international community has failed to live up to the spirit and aspirations of the United Nations to rid the world of inequality, violence, and domination of one people by another. Justice is antithetical to revenge. Freedom is an inalienable right and a natural entitlement that cannot be denied to any people. The Palestinian people deserve their independence. They deserve to have a home of their own in territories already recognized by this very assembly and by international law, which is being routinely ignored. Nigeria continues to urge efforts to bring back on track the two-state solution that offers the prospect for a new beginning for the region.
Vice President Kashim Shettima there speaking on the war on Gaza, and of course you can imagine it has become a central global theme where global leaders have had their 2 cents on it, with an overriding support for the current war to come to an end. Ceasefire has been touted significantly, and of course that is Nigeria's position on this particular development. Let's talk about that, because as you can imagine, over the past 1 year now, since the October 7th incident that pretty much occasioned the developments where over 40,000 people have been killed on the Palestinian side and over 1,700 or thereabout on the Israeli side. We talked about virtue signaling, where global leaders come and they are very stern, they're very critical about the issues, but we've seen this re-echoed over and over since this siege became global news. And to date, it's been 1 year, or it's close to 1 year, I beg your pardon, we're here to October 7th, but it's getting to 1 year now, and not much has changed. The killings continue, and so on and so forth. What do you make of Nigeria's position vis-a-vis what other global leaders had to say about what's happening in Palestine?
Well, the Palestinian issue has come to remain like an incurable infection. From 1947-48 to date, I mean, the issues have remained the same. Now, leaders after leaders, ceasefire has become almost impossible despite the goodwill in the Middle East, in the Americas, in Europe, and other places, Africa inclusive. And we have this problem because the understanding around this Palestinian issue has become very intricate. And right now, the warring parties are truly looking forward to at least the world should do something. There's a sense of frustration around the globe as to why this issue is not receiving the kind of attention it does. Judgments of even the International Criminal Court has been passed and nothing happened. Resolutions of the United Nations, including the Security Council, has been passed. Nothing has happened. That's why the United Nations is now seen more as a talk shop rather than an effective organization that can enforce. I think that's the key word there. Enforce some of these resolutions, as good as they may look on paper.
Some have always talked about, and you as a diplomat will perhaps have a better insight on this one, that when it comes to diplomacy, it's about the big picture. It might take time, it might seem ineffective, but in the long run, it does work. But do you fear that 79 years in, and with everything that we're dealing with, whether it's climate change, insecurity, economic inequality, and all of the other prevailing issues, that the United Nations General Assembly is no longer fit for purpose, so to say?
Well, I think the demand for reform of the United Nations has been on for quite some time, because now it has become obvious that yes, for effectiveness, perhaps the United Nations needs a thorough review, including processes, protocols, and powers that perhaps need to be tweaked in such a way that there could be some enforcement mechanisms. Because if you pass resolutions that cannot be enforced, at the end of the day, it means really nothing. And people are losing faith in the system. Therefore, annual General Assembly, yes, it will come and go. Fantastic resolutions will be passed. People will be happy. People clap for speeches, in fact, including standing ovations. But what happens thereafter? I think that's the measure of what the United Nations has come to be. So to move away from the epithet of being a talk shop, that is why calls are being made for a review of the content of the United Nations itself, so that it does not translate into an annual ritual of speeches, resolutions passed, and then everybody goes home. It might be interesting to note that over the years, the United Nations has intervened as a result of some of these resolutions in various conflicts around the world. But bringing peace to some conflict zones has proven to be almost impossible in a lot of cases. And therefore, United Nations missions of different sorts of dimensions and the rest of them have gone out there. Some have minimally succeeded. Some totally failed. And you can cite places like Haiti, Myanmar, and some other places like that, that the United Nations went out and came back home literally empty-handed. No peace, and conflict still rages on. Therefore, we will need that reform. And if you see in speeches, there have been calls almost everywhere that United Nations needs to reform. The central theme should be justice, fairness to all nations, territories, and jurisdictions, which is apparently lacking, and which is at the root of some of these conflicts that we see, lack or absence of justice.
Okay, let's just go back to the Vice President's speech then. There's a lot more to unpack. Let's hear the next soundbite from Vice President Kashim Shettima's speech at the United Nations General Assembly.
Reform of the international financial architecture and promotion of a rules-based, non-discriminatory, open, fair, inclusive, equitable and transparent multilateral trading system. We are aware of the debilitating impacts of corruption on global prosperity and national progress. Process of corruption and illicit financial flows constitute a huge chunk of resources needed for sustainable development. The recovery and return of such funds to states of origin is a fundamental principle of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Therefore, the international community must promote practical measures to strengthen international cooperation to recover and return stolen assets and to eradicate safe havens that facilitate illicit flows of funds from developing countries to the developed economies.
Of course, war against corruption has become synonymous with Nigeria and other developing countries. The Vice President there highlighting the challenges that many developing countries such as Nigeria continue to face in their fight against corruption and the need for the international communities to synergize against that. But of course, at the very end of that clip, he did talk about the return of looted funds as well as resources back to countries of origin where so many African leaders have become guilty of this particular practice. I mean, we've been here before several times, right? Even the looted funds that have been partially returned have been relooted, as many Nigerians would allude to. What's your take on this particular position? Because the Tinubu administration itself is struggling to impose its will when it comes to fight against corruption.
Well, corruption in itself is like an anomaly, generally speaking, and specifically in the developing countries, has become so endemic that hardly would there be any country that is not guilty of the sin. Is either you are the looter or you are a warehouse, whichever. By African native intelligence, both are guilty. And you can see therefore that the world has created a kind of system where looted funds known to be are easily received, processed, and kept by some territories and jurisdictions, including proxy territories or vassal territories that the main country will tell you is not their problem, is outside their jurisdiction. Meanwhile, they are the actual administrators of these territories. And as long as the world keep such institutions or entities there, it means people are encouraged to actually loot and keep. So it's a global thing that I wouldn't want us to characterize that to be like an African problem. No, it's a global problem because we must share equally from the looters and keepers of the looted assets. And therefore, some of the notorious territories that have been known to be like a major warehouse of funds known to have been stolen needs to be addressed by the United Nations generally and then the financial institutions around the world, because there's no way some of these funds can be moved without knowledge. Particularly today in the digital era, paper trails and what have you are common, it's known, and yet what happens? People pretend as if it's not there. And we can see from, let's say, some of the expose that has happened on, let's say, the Panama Papers and the rest of them, you can clearly see that almost every country is affected. Corruption has stunted growth and development, particularly in the developing countries, where very scarce resources are looted away, kept unused, and yet people are suffering. Now, the same jurisdictions go back and borrow this same money from the institutions of the developed West in the pretext of we want a loan to develop. So it's a vicious cycle that, yes, the United Nations apparently needs to come in and break that chain so that resources will remain where they are supposed to be, because at the point of generation, this wealth are stolen easily and stashed away.
And do you think the global South or places like Europe, for instance, and the United States are on the same page with African governments who are trying to get back what belongs to the people?
Certainly, this is a divergence. The interests are quite diametrically opposed. Leave it alone, you will see that some countries, their banking system is such that it's secured in such a way that there's no transparency. And therefore, we cannot say such countries are assisting the developing countries or even willing to stop some of these abuses of patrimony of countries. Otherwise, how do you knowingly receive stolen funds, keep them, and comfortably do business with that without feeling of remorse or regret or whatsoever, knowing fully well that children are unable to go to school, women, maternal health is affected because of lack of hospitals, infrastructure not available, all because of looted funds. Now, it is a very difficult one for the United Nations, particularly the financial institutions, IMF, the World Bank, IFC, etc. And even when some of these resolutions have eventually been translated into financial intelligence institutions being set up across the globe to kind of synergize and fight against this corruption, what we have seen is there seems to be an increase in the volume, frequency, and impunity of corruption, generally speaking. And therefore, yes, the Vice President was right to observe this as an important aspect of our life, but the frustration is that very little can be achieved in this regard, because until the receivers of stolen funds also accept that they will not receive, there will continue to be thieves that will take away and stash.
One particular talking point that continues to reverberate and is re-echoed almost on a regular basis over the past 1.5 decades or so is the issue of climate change. And of course, in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what's currently going on in parts of the Middle East because of the war in Gaza, is the issue of climate change and energy crisis. So let's hear what Vice President Kashim Shettima had to say about the best way forward.
While the world is transitioning into the fourth industrial revolution, Africa remains energy deficient. The push for the accelerated implementation of SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, therefore, must take into account Africa's precarious situation. Nigeria believes that natural gas remains central to the search for solutions to the energy challenges that Africa and the international community face. Access to affordable, reliable, cleaner sources of energy is more than an environmental or developmental issue. It is a key factor in social peace and international security. Mr. President, Nigeria remains unwavering in its commitment to SDG 13, climate action, including the net zero ambition and transition from fossil fuel energy to clean energy. As a demonstration of this commitment, the government established the Presidential Committee on Climate Action and Green Economy Solutions and appointed a special presidential envoy on climate action. We will redouble our efforts to address the challenges posed by climate change, including the urgent need to transition from fossil fuel energy. Yet, such commitments must be juxtaposed with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and the relevant provisions of the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015.
Well, the Vice President there speaking on energy security as well as climate change and how the global South versus the global North have to come to some sort of agreement about the best way forward, because Africa still is energy insecure and of course is paying the price for some of these policy directions, especially when he mentioned SDG 13 there. So let's talk about the divergence that you pointed out earlier about what the rest of the world thinks is best for the earth, but how the rest of the 88%, which is the global south, feels, listen, we're not there yet. We still need these fossil fuels to develop. He talked about the fourth industrial revolution. What do you make of his points there?
Well, very clear and cogent in this case. Sincerely, we cannot be on the same platform globally. When we even talk about climate, which has given rise to some of these actions and pronouncements on climate change, etc., energy transition, etc., etc., Africa cannot be singing the same song. We were not responsible for the so-called pollution. We didn't enjoy the benefits of this energy, as it were, since the essence or commencement of the Industrial Revolution. And we are now being asked to pay for someone else's excesses.
But aren't we also paying for it? I mean, the natural disasters, like what we're dealing with most recently, the flooding, for instance, isn't that, I mean, I understand you're saying we're not part of those creating the problem, but we're suffering from the fallouts from what is obviously climate change induced catastrophe.
Okay. Climate change induced catastrophe, I disagree with you, unfortunately. I prefer climate pattern mismanagement rather than climate change being the result of what we are seeing. If you take the most recent example of some of these things, the massive flooding in Maiduguri, for instance, you cannot blame this on climate change. There's nothing that has changed in the climate. Nothing.
I mean, more rainfall? Obviously.
Well, not more rainfall, only that, yes, if we need to analyze that this has been a pattern rather than climate change. It has been a climate pattern. Flooding the last
Isn't
time.
that just semantics?
No,
Ambassador?
they are not. Climate change means.
I mean, there's scientific data that shows that the world, the earth is getting warmer and warmer.
Well, indeed, very interesting, but perhaps maybe for another day. But you could see in your reports earlier on this matter, like the flooding in Maiduguri. Do you remember saying in 1994, there was a similar flooding in Maiduguri? Today is 2024.
With regards to the dam, exactly.
But not just the dam. Even without the dam, there had been those kind of floodings 94, 84, 74, 64, going down the line. The fourth year of each decade, we have seen similar instances happening. What is actually different is mankind's uncontrolled, unmitigated, and unregulated urbanization has been partly responsible for what we are seeing. Places that ordinarily should never have had dwellings are today fully built up. And when water comes, it will usually find its way. And in so many places, therefore, you will see that whether there was climate change or not, this climate pattern is natural, it remains there, and it will always come. If we finish with 2024, I can almost bet you 2034, we should also be expecting another disaster of this nature, either less or more.
Yeah.
But surely, within the decade, the fourth year of the decade has become obvious that there will be like an increased rainfall. And if the floodplains are blocked, we have definitely a problem.
Yeah. So what do you make of our commitment? He talked about the Paris Accord and how the world needs to find a way to chart a new path forward. And you know, back in last year, with regards to the COP28 summit in Dubai, some commitments were made. How should Nigeria and the rest of Africa, for instance, key into some of these climate change initiatives, agenda, as well as action plans?
Well, I think sincerely, we in Africa and the developing countries or the global south, generally speaking, are like being cajoled into accepting and agreeing to do certain things that ordinarily should not be, because if we have to engage in all the planned energy transition programs, you will find that it might even stunt our industrial development, because we are not there. We were not also there when some of these things took place. Now, coal is one important maybe mineral that I may want to say something. Coal has been demonized in a way to be responsible for the amount of pollution, generally speaking. And now science has also gone back to say, okay, but the same coal can also be utilized given new technologies. And therefore, let's say fossil fuel today, if we say we are transiting absolutely from fossil fuel to some other new renewables and what have you, what happens to the fossil fuel itself? Abandoned? And can Africa actually afford? Because the new renewables are oftentimes more expensive.
So you think our timeline for transitioning should not be the same with the rest of the world?
Certainly not, because we are not there. And it is like comparing apples and tomatoes, or what can you say? We are not yet there, and our leaders need to rethink this whole process, because if we are railroaded into believing that whatever comes from the north becomes global, just like that, sincerely, we will pay a price.
Yeah, but we sign these treaties, we sign these agreements.
Yes.
And we're supposed to make good on our own part of the bargain, isn't it?
We have signed so many other treaties and protocols without even analyzing what it is in there for us. And I think that is the major problem. When going to some of these summits, sincerely, we hardly do diligence or justice to some of these things that we are signing. We just go to show we are good, in quotes. We go ahead because that's the mainstream. It shouldn't be so. We should be questioning some of these propositions, because it is what benefits the West or the global North that generally comes and becomes the agenda of these international bodies. I cannot understand how we are going to abandon fossil fuel just because we want to be part of the energy transition. A developing country and a major oil-rich country like Nigeria, we need to approach some of these things with caution. We can't just accept whatever they say we should do and just continue doing. No, I think energy transition should be like in parallels. Whereas,
so there should be a hybrid plan where we're still exploring these natural resources while planning for the future.
Very, very well. And thank God, in a way, fossil fuel happens to be that, let's say from the crude itself, because of plastics and other components, it means exploration and exploitation shall continue for a foreseeable future. Not just to process gasoline and some of the oils, but some of these plastics and the rest of them will continue. Otherwise, for us as a nation, it means we will come to a cliff and end there and have to now reboot ourselves into thinking of some new energy sources and energy complexities that are beyond us in sometimes, because we don't even have the technology ourselves. Therefore, if we are going to rely on someone else's technology to develop some of these things, we are at a disadvantage. We will pay for something that ordinarily we shouldn't be part of. So our leaders need to think a little more differently from what is actually going on.
We understand that, over the past few years, I think at a Paris Africa Summit, the one in China also with African leaders, the global north is trying to sweeten the deal for African leaders and African governments to buy into this idea of this transition and the preparedness to take certain compromises when it comes to climate change. Do you think that monetizing these incentives will perhaps affect the decision of our political leaders to cave in?
Well, the developed West has always had this bait whenever they find that a particular agenda might be difficult to swallow, just like that. And it's not new. Starting from the EPA agreements of some years back, you could see how Europe in particular paid so much money as incentives for leaders to just accept, and then including coercion. Some countries, smaller countries that had no voice of their own, were coerced into signing agreements that, with the benefit of hindsight, became obvious that they shouldn't have signed those agreements in the first place. So today, the global north is still pursuing some of this agenda with the sinister motive of providing incentives. If all is well, why should there be incentive? If all is well, why should there be incentive before someone can sign?
One would say because of uniformity, so that we all move in one direction.
Unfortunately, the world is not uniform, and therefore we can't move in the same direction or the same level, because we are different, we remain different, and we shall have to look at some of these things in the context of who we are, where we are, and where we are going. Otherwise, we will continue to be like trailers, and that can never be in our interest as Africans or the global South, generally speaking. You can see the language of Chinese, Russians, and Indians in some respect are slightly different from the collective language of Europe and America in all this. That's why they are willing to sacrifice a huge sums of money to say they are inducing Africans to accept some of these resolutions. Well, no. We should, I think, set aside this money and then look at facts as they should be, because otherwise we'll continue to get it wrong, and we would have committed ourselves to signing agreements that we cannot implement, or if we implement, they may not be in our interest as countries.
And on the economic front, he did talk about how the global debt burden is undermining the capacity of countries and governments to meet the needs of their citizens, crippling trade barriers, I beg your pardon, and protectionist policies that are destroying the hopes of prosperity in peoples and nation. And we started the conversation pointing out that Nigeria's debt profile is hovering above 121 trillion naira. And you could say the same thing about so many other developing countries on the continent, in Asia and other parts of the world. Debt forgiveness is one expression or phrase that many experts have used to describe the Vice President's speech in that national statement. How does it usually work when we talk about debt forgiveness and restructuring some of these debts, so that countries like Nigeria, for instance, while navigating this very difficult, tumultuous economic situation, can find some breathing room so that they can also, fast track their economic development?
Well, debt, generally speaking, is one of the greatest difficulties that this world has to contend with. And I think if there was anything we need to call for reforms, is the financial institution architecture globally needs to be reformed, because we can't even ask of reform of the United Nations without first asking of reform of, let's say, the Bretton Woods institutions. Because these Bretton Woods institutions, put them together, World Bank, IMF, IFC, etc., have promoted poverty around the world much more than anything else through very bad policies of loans and conditionalities that are almost impossible to fulfill. Debt forgiveness, therefore, is a phenomenon that, yes, Nigeria can call for it, but I think, to my mind, it goes beyond that. This is not the first time Nigeria is asking for debt forgiveness, nor for other developing countries in Africa, generally speaking. And yet the problem still persists, which means the diagnosis, prescriptions, and or treatments are wrong in the first place. Otherwise, by now, we should have no reason talking about debt forgiveness whatsoever. We shouldn't even be talking about debt burden at all. But the way the financial architecture is skewed in such a way that countries are unable to pay back their loans means structurally there is something wrong intrinsically in these financial institutions.
It's a function of coincidence or mismanagement, or do you think these systems are deliberately designed in such a way that it will keep Africa and the rest of the developing world in this particular trap?
Well, it is a trap in itself. The loans are just a bait in that trap, because if we cast our mind back to, let's say, 1986, Nigeria lost its sovereignty, so to say, from adopting the structural adjustment program that precedes loans by the IMF and World Bank, which were imposed. We didn't need those loans. Those loans were imposed on us, and as a consequence, we were asked to restructure. And adopting the structural adjustment program meant devaluing your currency overnight, removing subsidies of all sorts, selling off your national assets to people who were coming from another level of economy, where when they take 1% of whatsoever, they come here because you have devalued your currency, it becomes like 1,000 times more value. So apparently they came and looted our national assets in the name of structural adjustment program. We have never recovered from that. Today, we are back to the same prescription. How can Nigeria be asked to devalue its currency? Within a period of 1 year, we have lost so much value for ourselves as a sovereign entity without any explanation. There is no way you can say the dollar in comparison here in Nigeria and, let's say, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, Egypt, South Africa. It's unimaginable. The size of our GDP vis-a-vis the same value of this international currency called the dollar in these countries cannot be at parity with what it should be. So there is something fundamentally wrong. And sincerely, we have seen that America in particular and Europe lately, we are designing some of these programs to ensure that we do not really develop.
Right.
Our leaders need to have a total rethink, because we cannot be managing our own people for the benefit of these colonialists or imperialists. I think something is very, very fundamentally wrong in the way we go.
Okay, just on a final note, there are some events on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. They usually countries take advantage of to sign deals, to make certain agreements with the business community, with other countries. How does it usually go, and what do you think Nigeria is trying to explore, especially given the renewed hope agenda of the current administration?
Well, surely the activities at the sidelines of the United Nations sometimes are even more important than the speech giving at the General Assembly. And important business decisions are taken, or investment decisions are taken between countries. That is usually bilateral in this case. So yes, I think the government must have been selling the renewed hope agenda to the international community within the confines of the United Nations General Assembly, and we hope more of investments can come in through such means. That's the only, perhaps, bargaining power in whatever we spend to sponsor the delegations there. Otherwise, if it is to just go and deliver a speech, I think it's not worth it.
Right, okay. All right, we're going to have to leave it here for now. Interesting conversation. Ambassador Warkani, as always, we appreciate your expert analysis and insight on this one. Thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, that is our show for you tonight. Thank you most kindly for joining us. Feel free, as always, to stay in touch with us by following us across our social media platforms. You can also watch this program and many others on our website, trusttv.com. My name is Abdullahi Ahmed. For myself and the rest of the team, thank you for your time. We'll see you soon.